So I'm here today with Vanessa Corredera, and she is an associate professor and departmental chair of English at Andrews University. Her scholarship focuses on race and representation in Shakespearean adaptations, appropriations, and performance, and has appeared in EMLS, Shakespeare Quarterly, the Journal of American Studies, and Borrowers and Lenders, as well as the Routledge Handbook to Shakespeare and Global Appropriation. Her book on appropriations of Othello in Post-Racial America is forthcoming with Edinburgh University Press. All right. So one of the articles that I read by you, which I thought was really fascinating, reads Othello and Jordan Peele's film Get Out, and also draws on Peter Erickson's method of cross-historical tracing. Erickson describes this method as one that, quote, recognizes and respects boundaries between different time periods so that individual points on the larger spectrum remain separate and distinct. Rather than putting our contemporary moment off limits as an illegitimate critical resource, this inclusive approach explicitly looks to contemporary art practice as an arena from which, in part, we learn what the issues are and how to formulate the questions to ask. So would you mind talking a bit about your process of cross-historical tracing? Do you tend to begin in the contemporary? Do you tend to start with Shakespeare? Or how do these connections between time periods kind of emerge for you?
That's a really good question. I'll tell you how it emerged with this particular project, but I think the answer would be that they emerge differently depending on the piece or where my mind is at, or just sometimes an uncontrolled confluence of I'm working on X and I'm working on Y in two different spaces, and the two kind of clash and meet. So this particular piece, I really have to give credit to my students, because they were the ones who were all over it. And they, Dr. Corredera, have you seen Get Out? Have you seen Get Out? And I'm a big baby and don't watch horror movies because they scare me, as they're supposed to. But I don't like to be scared. And so they were telling me that I needed to watch this, and that they knew that I would be able to write about it. So credit to them, for being excited and attuned to what I was working on. And sure enough, I watched it and I was like, oh, okay, well, there are a lot of overlaps here with Othello. But what was interesting to me were both, of course, the overlaps, but then also the deviations from Othello, and the way that race works in both of the different pieces, right, in the drama and then the film. So I would say that was definitely a case of starting with the contemporary and then looking backwards. And then there are other times where it might be that I have looked at something in its own time. So I would say the public facing piece I wrote for Sundial on the Merchant of Venice and the Quality of Mercy's pedagogy project. That project, now that was collaborative because it was student led, but that project was definitely one where we started with the early modern, where we looked at the play and we thought about its themes and its historical context. And then we looked to today and considered, okay, what for our community would be the modern day equivalent of what Shylock is experiencing, what some of the other characters are enacting in this particular play, and that helps us explore XY themes that were assigned to our group. So I don't think that the cross-historical just goes one way for me. And sometimes it just comes with just by chance. So the piece that I wrote on Key and Peele and their Othello sketch just happened to be because I watched Key and Peele. And so I was like, oh, what's Othello doing here? Okay. And so that just happened to be there, right? And so it started with the contemporary because that's what I was watching at the moment. And so I think that that's the beauty of the cross historical, is that it can go, it's not unidirectional, and it allows for these really interesting connections. That means that you have to be curious and attuned and creative. And that's what I think makes me really excited about the method.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think I also love the way that your pedagogy kind of informs that too, with your interactions with your students. So yeah, that's great. Another question, you consider the limits of the argument of Shakespeare's universality, the idea that Shakespeare's work is timeless and speaks to a universal condition, by arguing that this is especially not the case for Black audiences. That said, you see the potential for contemporary adaptations to extend Shakespeare's relevance to broader audiences. So what is it about adaptations or appropriations that you see having this power to extend Shakespeare's authenticity and relevance? So I know you talked about this a little bit in your a bit in your Key and Peele and Othello paper, but I was wondering if you would talk a bit more about that and kind of expand on that too for those who are watching.
So I think that when you're thinking about adaptations and appropriations, they tend to you tend to have the potential for freedom. And I want to say potential because I take really seriously Ayanna Thompson's work and Joyce Green McDonald's work, Peter Erickson's work, where they caution that just because something's an adaptation or appropriation, especially when it comes to race, it doesn't mean that that piece is going to be automatically reparative or ameliorative or liberatory or invested in race and social justice in any meaningful way. Sometimes they, in fact, work to reify the very problems inherent in whatever you count as the original Shakespearean text. And on top of that, sometimes they can exacerbate them too with some of the choices that are made. So I just want to preface by saying that, but I also think that adaptations and appropriations are often freed a little bit because the idea behind the original or the authentic is about hewing as closely as possible to whatever, as MJ Kidney has said, we decide as a collective is the original work, right? Is like whatever we decide is the kind of limit between the original and the adaptation. And so that means that adaptations often feel more comfortable being freer with language, with casting choices that are non-traditional, with changing the plot, right, with excising or adding pieces that might be able to transform the way that issues of gender, sexuality, race, ability function within a particular text. And so I think it's that freedom, and I would call it the imaginative potential of adaptation and appropriation that really matters, right? I think that that is why they can extend Shakespeare's authenticity and relevance, because there's the potential there for this imaginative freedom, like the liberation from having to stick to a particular script. And I think that that can happen in really surprising ways and places. So even something that's more traditional, like the public theater's Much Ado About Nothing, right, that kept a lot of the language, it kept the narrative, but it played with casting, it played with the cultural touchstones of the production. Kenny Leon and Ayanna Thompson online talk about the way that they allow the actors to use their own accents, and so even the voice was this kind of appropriative act, because they're taking it away from what looks like the traditional kind of theater and the traditional voice and kind of repurposing it. And so I think what's really nice about adaptation as appropriation is, one, like I've been saying, the freedom, but two, their capaciousness. You can adapt and appropriate all over the place, right? Whether it is the kind of genre or mode, or it can be, an act of power, right? To adapt or appropriate even within a genre or mode that looks more traditional or authentic, but the choices made can be appropriative or adaptive, even if the genre looks more traditional. And so I think it's that capaciousness that allows for the hope or possibility of appropriations and adaptations to have more relevance and maybe not extend Shakespeare's authenticity, but extend his reach and maybe intervene in some of the harm that Shakespeare's work and Shakespeare's this kind of great signifier has been used, has caused in the past to all sorts of people who have been barred from accessing Shakespeare.
Yeah, great, thank you. I guess kind of a follow-up question to that too. So while the bulk of your work is on Othello, you also have this co-authored piece that I was really interested in, that puts the HBO series Westworld in conversation with The Tempest. So I was curious, are there other contemporary adaptations of other Shakespeare plays that you're particularly excited about and see as having the potential to open up yet another untapped space of maybe cross-historical analysis through adaptation or appropriation or any of those things that you've talked about? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I, like many Shakespeareans, am waiting to see the Coens, Joel Cohen's Macbeth. I'm
Mhm.
not sure if I think that it's going to be better or open up new avenues, because I don't know yet. But right, when you have this auteur director, when you have, Denzel and Frances McDormand, who are these amazing actors doing this particular play in black and white, right, where they're talking about, Cohen has talked about how chiaroscuro has been this kind of framework for him, right? They'll play between light and dark, and that of course fits thematically with this play. And then I just happened to have been reading Katie Vamera Santos's work on forthcoming work on Macbeth and the racialization of Macbeth with narco trafficking stories. And so I'm just thinking like, oh, okay. And she cites like Wayward Macbeth. And so I've been thinking about like, oh, well, how does this kind of circulation of Macbeth and race and ethnicity, how will that kind of inform this production or not? Right. And I mean, I'm not the only one. I think a lot of people who have not been able to watch it are waiting for the holiday season to see, if Twitter is any indication, and maybe it's not, it can be an echo chamber for Shakespeareans, right? But I think that will be exciting. But the other pieces that I've been really interested in lately have been ones that I think maybe some scholars aren't as interested in, because sometimes they're not very good. But I've been curious about youth centered and youth focused Shakespeare and adaptations. So just to give some examples, there has been this Marvel comic book adaptation of Shakespeare where the Marvel characters, it's like brand new, where the Marvel characters are all Shakespearean. Or there's the new No Fear Shakespeare, which I'm not a fan of the No Fear Shakespeare, but I am interested in these No Fear Shakespeare graphic novels that are being marketed to high school students, because it's one thing to have the No Fear Shakespeare and making choices about language, but then when you're making choices about visuals and representation, right, that's a whole nother way of thinking through embodied Shakespeare that's super interesting, right, once you're thinking about graphic novels and when they're tapping into, these graphic traditions of like comic books, etc. So I think youth Shakespeare is a place that I'm really interested in, because it dovetails with my interest in thinking through when do we start talking about Shakespeare and race? Is it in high school? Is it in college? How early can we start doing this work? How early is Shakespeare being used to create ideas of racial formation, whether people realize it or not? And I would say usually not, right? At least my high school experience was that we didn't talk about Shakespeare and race at all. And I think that's changing. But then that means that we also need to examine the tools that we're using for that pedagogy, right? The films, the graphic novels, the plays, the productions, et cetera, all the pieces that we're using to teach Shakespeare and race to, say, youth and high school students before they get to college, and thinking through what kind of identity politics are going on in those Shakespeare pieces. So those are the ones I'm most excited about.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's so great. I actually am really curious because I think like pedagogy has come up in like a couple of your answers to the questions. And I'm really, no, but I love that because I have like such a deep interest in pedagogy as like a former middle and high school teacher and also a graduate from a university that was like largely a teaching college. So I know that where you work, Andrews University does focus a lot on pedagogy and is largely a teaching institution. So I was wondering, just kind of as a follow-up to that, if you wouldn't mind talking a bit more about the way that you teach Shakespeare in the classroom, or kind of like, you started to say this with the Marvel adaptations, but things that you might recommend or resources for teaching Shakespeare and race in even like the secondary level.
So the way that I've taught Shakespeare, that I teach Shakespeare and race in the classroom has changed. I think when I first started, it was very traditional. It was very historicist. So even though I was making cross historical connections in my research, that doesn't mean that that's what I was always doing in my classroom. And the thing, I really noticed this when I taught an upper division seminar on Shakespeare and on, actually, it wasn't just Shakespeare and race. It was just Renaissance and race in general. And so it was, it was a lot more than just Shakespeare. And I encouraged my students to think cross-historically. I told them they could write cross-historical papers for their final papers if they wanted to. And I thought it was enough to assign these early modern texts alongside more contemporary theoretical voices, right? So they might read, they might read primary texts and historical texts from the Renaissance, but then they might also read excerpts from Fanon, for example. Okay, that didn't work. Like, so what I got really was historicist or a version of new historicist readings of these plays and poems, and that was fine. But I was like, okay, what am I doing that is not allowing the students to feel as if they can make those connections? And so I'm like, well, I'm doing what I was taught to do in grad school, and that's not a knock on what I was taught to do in grad school, but that also wasn't their aim. Their aim wasn't to teach me how to make these cross-historical connections, right? It was a deep historicist training. And so I changed how I teach and started very intentionally thinking about my end goal and working backwards from there to think about how every unit can support that. And so I brought in a lot more performance. And so for every, so it did become more Shakespeare focused. And I have I still kind of worry about that. Like, I've given up, reading certain poems and pieces, and to do a little bit more with Shakespeare. But part of it is about access. I don't have access to a bunch of Marlowe performances, but I do have to RSC Shakespeare performances, for example, or the Globe or whatever. So I brought in a lot more performance, and then I brought in adaptations and appropriations. So for each play, we would watch a performance and think about the performance elements. And then we would also read or watch or listen to an adaptation or appropriation of that same play. And I think that worked a lot better because the students who wanted to do a historicist reading absolutely could, because we still framed the play in that way. But then those who were interested in performance could delve into the performance elements. Those who were interested in adaptation and appropriation could delve into those pieces. And so it really did help the students make much more cross-historical connections because I changed how I teach. And so, for example, just to give a brief example, when we were reading Othello, we read Othello, and then we talked a little bit about how Black masculinity, like we read Bell Hooks, and then we talked about how Black masculinity resonates in the 21st century, right? And what are the presuppositions then that 21st century audiences might be bringing to Othello, even if they weren't, right, in early modernity. And so then we also, Jay-Z's album, I'm forgetting the title of the album, where the story of OJ, right, had that song, so had just come out. So we listened to that song, right? We talked about how OJ had been a touchstone, how Othello had been a touchstone for the OJ Simpson trial way back, in the 90s. And then we thought about, okay, like, why is Jay-Z bringing up OJ? And like, what are some of the themes that are circulating across all these kind of moments? Othello, right? OJ Simpson trial. And then this song that had just come out at that particular time, that year that I was teaching. So that's what I try to do. It takes a lot of work and preparation, and sometimes it works really well, and sometimes it can go a little sideways because I can't control how my students are what they're gonna see and the connections they're gonna make. But I wanna make sure that they're seeing the relevance of these conversations to their lives. And maybe they're not gonna remember Othello, and they're probably not gonna remember the story of OJ either, but if they can remember these conversations we're having about race and about identity and take those with them, then, some of them will go on to get PhDs, but lots of them are going to be dentists and doctors and librarians. And so they'll be able to use those tools in other ways. And then hopefully if they remember a few pieces of poetry with it, I'll be very happy.
Yeah, I love that. Thanks so much. So Kim F. Hall draws on Toni Morrison's call for an examination of literary whiteness to extend how we think about race in the early modern period. Your work centers both Blackness and whiteness in Othello, but the bulk of it, your work considers, not centers, both Blackness and whiteness in Othello, but the bulk of it considers the reception of Black audiences and how we might read Othello from a point of view that centers Blackness. So how does centering Blackness in Othello influence your readings of whiteness in Othello? Or maybe more generally, what do you see your relationship being to critical whiteness studies?
So I'll answer both of those because the first one I can answer briefly. I tend to talk a lot. That's how my brain thinks. And so I have to be careful with meandering answers.
Oh,
But I think that centering Blackness and Othello influences your, not you personally, but the kind of ones or my potential sympathy for and identification with whiteness in the play, right? So as a light-skinned Latina, I mean, I'm not in that play, right? But if I'm going to a production, let's say I was going to a production growing up, well, I definitely look more, actually, usually like Bianca or Amelia than, what's usually petite and blonde Desdemona. And so, if you're looking at this, it defamiliarizes and it asks me to put myself into a different narrative position, right? To think a little bit about who I have sympathy for and why. And it because it's really easy to, this is the thing with Get Out, with when we talk about like the character that Allison Williams plays, right? It's really easy to, because we've been generally in society tries to teach us to be very sympathetic toward white femininity. And I'm not saying that there shouldn't be sympathy for Desdemona. She is murdered, she is innocent, but that doesn't mean that she also isn't complicit in some of the in some of the marginalization and exoticization of Othello. And so thinking through Othello's perspective and his point of view and his affective positionality just gives a different approach to some of the other characters and helps you to see that they're all kind of complicated and complex and complicit. And that is in part why people love Shakespeare, right? The characters can be horrible yet interesting, right? Have beautiful poetry yet incredibly toxic. You can be sympathetic toward Othello and know that, right, his abuse of his wife is wrong. And so I think that it allows you to have more sympathy and identification with and for Othello in the way that Ian Smith has called for, right? Seeing it from his perspective allows you to see humanity and subjectivity in that character. And so one of the things that the way that I respond to critical whiteness studies in general has been to think a lot more about the way that whiteness tries to position itself as neutral, the way that whiteness is a shifting target, right? So who gets to be white and what white has been and when has moved around quite a bit, and to call that out, to think about how the predominance of white audiences across Shakespearean domains, especially the theater. So this is in my book, so please read my book, but especially the theater, but also comic books, right? So when you're looking at the history of graphic novels, when you're thinking about who's listening to podcasts, so I've written on Serial, but in the book I elaborate a lot more on the fact that an NPR audience isn't necessarily all white, but there's an assumption of a predominantly white audience. So if you're thinking about these different domains, the way that a film, right, a film that isn't marketed as an ethnic or racial film, so we know what that means, right, a Black film or a Hispanic film, well, they're really usually a white film, but no one's calling them that, right? They're just they're just art, they're just a film. And so it's been calling that out and thinking and just saying the presumption of whiteness as the intended audience, how does that shape the way that Shakespeare is told, the way that Othello is retold? We're back to the imaginative potential allowed or disallowed when shaping an adaptation or appropriation. And how then can we combat, and being those of us who are invested in rethinking race and Shakespeare, how can we combat that in our classrooms, in our scholarship, right, in the performances that we might be involved in helping shape? How can the preponderance of whiteness be set aside to have new artistic and interpretive possibilities, and acknowledge where sometimes there are challenges like finances and power structures, et cetera, that don't allow for that setting aside, but at least calling that out when that is the case.
yeah. Thanks so much. Yeah. And then as a last final question, you have an article forthcoming this spring that asks, where are we in the melody of the new scholarly song of early modern race studies, a turn originally posed by Kim F. Hall and Peter Erickson. So where do you situate yourself and your work within that field?
That was a really influential introduction to a special issue. And I took it to heart. You have two scholars who are taking the time to lay out a kind of roadmap, which is rare, right? So sometimes you'll have you can have people who are galvanizing for change within a field, but the question is often how do you do it? And they actually laid out they laid out how, like, here are the things that need to happen. That is very helpful. And so I took it, and that happened early enough in my academic career where I was also shifting my scholarly focus at the time. So I was those who teach at a teaching heavy institutions know that, like, moving on after the dissertation is a slower process. You don't just kind of hit out the gate to go do the book project because, right, you're teaching so many classes. And so it was a little bit into my teaching experience, and I was changing my research. And so I just took that seriously and thought about, if I want to be part of this conversation, which I do because I'm passionate about it, how do I not stay in the past, but help it move forward, even in a tiny way, right? And I would say that what I really hope to do is help expand the archive of pre-modern critical race studies by looking at adaptations and appropriations. I think that in some areas they are still seen as less serious and less significant than archival work. I'm not saying everybody, I'm saying some people, right? And that is, I think, incorrect because they have such a wide reach. They have a potential global reach. They definitely reach our students much more often than some of the archives, because our students aren't even allowed in certain archives, and they aren't even allowed to access certain texts. And so I think it is important to continue to speak to and expand on the pre-modern critical race studies archive. And I hope I'm doing that by attending to pop culture, by attending to performances, by attending to adaptations and appropriations, and to keep up with the cross-historical elements, because I think that those cross-historical connections also allow for public-facing work, right? So that you can write pieces or do talks that are going to help people see history in the present in different ways. And that calls into question how much progress sometimes we assume we've made today. If you're still seeing resonances with the late 1500s and early to mid 1600s, that should give us pause to think about what hasn't changed and why, and what investments Western culture continues to make in certain racial, gendered, when it comes to sexuality or ability, when those hierarchies, and how we can we change them, and how we can continue to do so. So that's what I hope to do. And that's where I would situate myself in that work, is to try to kind of theorize how to bring pre-modern critical race studies and adaptation and appropriation studies, specifically Shakespearean adaptation appropriation studies, into tighter and more theoretical conversation with each other in the classroom and in scholarship.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining me today and talking about your work.
Thank you for having me.